The twin suns of the planet Virex Prime cast harsh shadows across the gleaming towers of the Galactic Academy of Tactical Excellence. Here, in the heart of Sector 12, the most advanced minds from over 40 intelligent species train for the kind of war that spans stars and centuries. Lecture halls spiraled upward like crystalline shells, simulation chambers pulsed with neural interfaces, and instructors who had once commanded battle cruisers now taught students how to anticipate moves 4 dimensions ahead. In this environment of brilliance, precision, and discipline, Mason Calder stuck out like a sore wound. He arrived late to lectures, not because of arrogance or laziness, but because he always seemed to misread the constantly shifting digital signs posted in alien dialects. He'd walk into the middle of lectures on triphase formation collapse theory or neutron net siege doctrine and ask in perfect but out-of-place Earth English, "Sorry, is this advanced starship psychology or—" Heads would turn. Tentacles would twitch. Wings would flutter. Gills would vibrate in tones of mocking surprise. Mason would offer an awkward half-smile and take a seat near the back, usually alone. He didn't dress like the others either. While alien cadets proudly bore the holographic sashes or crystalline rank medallions of their home systems, Mason wore the standard Academy-issue uniform, ill-fitted, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and almost always wrinkled. His boots had scuff marks. His hair refused to stay neat. He had a habit of tapping his stylus against his knee when bored, which was often since he couldn't follow most of the lectures. During exams, he sat silently for long stretches, staring at the hollow screens filled with complex tactical scenarios. Simulated battlefields sprawled across sectors with variables such as wormhole interference, energy leaching, and fourth-dimensional ambush vectors. Other cadets calculated solutions in minutes. Mason stared, bit his lip, and guessed. Badly. His most recent score in advanced asymmetrical conflict theory was 6%. The automated grading system flagged it as a statistical anomaly so rare it requested a manual review. When the instructor confirmed that the answers were simply incorrect, utterly, profoundly incorrect, the system appended a note: strategic logic absent, pattern recognition 0, recommendation, remedial assessment. Mason didn't argue. He never did. He simply nodded, thanked the instructor, and left the hall. But that didn't stop the whispers. "Did you see what he answered on the multiple choice about how to break a siege?" hissed a scaled cadet with 6 eyes and a navy blue uniform ribbon denoting top 5% ranking. He suggested lighting debris on fire and rolling it downhill. "What downhill? It's orbital." "Maybe Earth thinks in gravity terms only," replied a silicon-based species cadet, her voice translating through the ambient field. "Or maybe he thinks this is a history museum." "He's just a failed charity pick," muttered a third cadet, "probably placed here by the Interstellar Diversity Council. 1 human per class, just to tick a box." Instructors weren't cruel, but even they had stopped trying. Commander Lernax, a decorated tactician from the Zovari front who now taught advanced orbital siege planning, once pulled Mason aside after a disastrous group presentation. The human had misunderstood the assignment, mistimed every move in the simulation, and cost his team a hypothetical outpost in 3 planetary colonies. "Mason," Commander Lernax said, folding his forearms across his broad chest, "I admire your spirit, but strategy is not instinct. It is studied, memorized, rehearsed. You seem unwilling or unable to grasp this." Mason had only nodded. "I just think differently, sir." Differently is not the same as effectively. Mason left the office without saying another word. Still, he showed up every day. He was always there, sitting quietly, watching, taking notes that no one could understand, pages filled with messy arrows, stick figures, and phrases like bait with sound, not location, rage, shoanashanchas, blind flank, and the faster he moves, the more he bleeds. His dorm room was equally odd. Most cadets decorated their quarters with emblems of their species or calming simulations of their homeworlds. Mason's room had crude paper maps pinned to the wall. No one printed on paper anymore. One alien cadet who dared to enter during a hall-wide room inspection found a strange object under Mason's bed. An old, scratched tin box filled with Earth photographs. Jungle warfare, WP soldiers, guerrilla fighters. Mason didn't explain. He just asked him not to touch it. He had no friends, not real ones. A few cadets tolerated him in team exercises because the rules required it. A female cadet from IREX 4 once tried to include him in a casual war game during a social break. Mason lost 5 rounds in a row but kept playing, his smile never fading. She didn't invite him again. And yet, despite it all, he never quit. He jogged laps every morning before sunrise, even though the Academy's gravitational settings were slightly higher than Earth's and made his knees ache. He practiced in the weapons simulator every week, though he always scored just average. He showed up early for his simulation prep, sometimes sitting alone in the chamber for 20 minutes, sketching plans on his hand with a marker. What no one understood was that Mason wasn't unaware of his reputation. He wasn't oblivious. He just didn't care. Back on Earth, he had grown up in a family of survivors. Not tacticians, not generals. Just people who got through whatever hell life threw at them. Poverty, floods, broken systems. His father taught him to never trust a plan made by someone who never stepped in mud. His mother once told him that real intelligence wasn't knowing how to win a game, but knowing how to change it. He carried that with him. So when the Academy announced the final exam, a live simulation known as the harrowing spiral, long believed to be unwinnable, Mason didn't laugh or protest like the others. He just looked at the schedule, blinked once, and went back to sketching in his notebook. In the dining hall that evening, when the topic came up, a reptilian cadet with 6 medals hanging from his collar chuckled loudly. "I'm placing bets. 10 credits Mason doesn't last 10 minutes in the spiral." Laughter rippled across the hall. Mason, seated alone in the corner, kept eating. He didn't look up. But under the table, his fingers tapped a rhythm on his leg. 4 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, 1 beat. A code he used when thinking through a trap. The final exam was coming. And Mason, the Academy's favorite failure, had a plan. Morning in the Academy always began with the shifting of light filters as the primary sun crested Virex Prime's upper horizon. The corridors glowed gold and violet, casting long shadows along the black-tiled floors as cadets from every corner of the Galactic Federation filed into formation for their daily assignments. The atmosphere inside the Hall of Ascension was unusually charged. A buzz traveled through the ranks, low whispers, muffled chuckles, the occasional nudge between companions. Mason stood near the rear of the 3rd platoon line, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm, his notebook tucked under one arm. His name hadn't been spoken yet, but he knew exactly what the sudden energy in the air meant. It was score release day. He heard the first wave of murmurs ripple across the hall when the official projection blinked into existence above the central podium. A rotating pillar of holographic data spun lazily, names and ranks shifting with every slow turn. The top 5 cadets were already being celebrated by their peers, some clapping the highest score on the back, others scanning for their own placement with quiet anxiety. And then, inevitably, someone said his name. Mason Calder, last again, out of 612. The voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Mason didn't flinch. His gaze rested on the hologram without emotion. He had learned long ago that reacting only gave them fuel. A reaction meant acknowledgement, and that's what the mockers always wanted. So he just let it hang in the air, the weightless insignificance of his ranking sliding off him like dust in zero gravity. Further down the hall, someone snorted. "I bet he'll pull a self-sacrifice in the spiral just to avoid finishing." Another cadet followed up. "Or forget which way is up and crash into his own reinforcements." The laughter grew bolder now that Mason hadn't moved. A professor entered the hall and gave a stern glance, which made a few of the noisiest aliens compose themselves. But the smugness on their faces didn't fade. Mason blinked slowly and turned away from the board. He didn't need to see the rest. The rankings meant nothing to him now, not after everything he had come to understand about this place. He walked quietly down the hall toward the rear archive chamber, where few cadets ever went unless assigned. The archive was quiet, dimly lit, and always smelled faintly of ionized crystal. It stored decommissioned modules from older training programs, strategies considered obsolete by modern standards, and psychology records from long-forgotten wars. But Mason came here often. He didn't look for answers in the new. He looked for patterns in what others had discarded. He pulled up a faded terminal and entered a command that brought up combat simulations from 90 cycles ago. Scenarios abandoned because alien military thinkers had deemed them irrelevant. His fingers moved quickly, selecting one called Desert Convergence, Twin Siege. He watched as two forces clashed, then rewound it, then again. Each time he studied a single corner of the map, a shadow that flickered out of sequence, a move that made no sense at first glance. To anyone else, it was boring, pointless, but to Mason, it was preparation. Later that day, he sat alone in the mess hall, scanning old tactical journals on a crumpled tablet and scratching ideas in his notebook. Across the hall, three cadets from the Khazar system watched him with poorly concealed amusement. One of them, lean, tall, dressed in polished gray armor overlaid with silver house markings, rose from his table and sauntered over. "Calder," he said, his voice smooth like oil on steel. "I just wanted to thank you." Mason looked up. "For what?" "For helping the rest of us look so good." The cadet grinned. "Your presence guarantees someone will always rank last. It really takes the pressure off." Mason stared at him for a moment, then offered a polite nod. "Glad I could help." The cadet hesitated as if expecting a different reaction, then scoffed and walked off. Mason returned to his notes. He wrote something down in the margin. When expectations sink low enough, surprise becomes a weapon. The day rolled forward. Briefings were delivered. Sim schedules were finalized. Cadets practiced in open drills, reviewing standard formations and battle pairings. Mason didn't participate. His slot had been rescheduled, again, due to instructor unavailability. He didn't complain. He used the time to visit the outdoor training field where rusted, deactivated drones were stored behind the Academy's old supply depot. Most saw the junkyard as useless. Mason saw a puzzle of possibilities. He spent an hour walking between the dead machines, running his fingers across old sensor ports, scanning inactive shielding nodes, and studying the design flaws that had once made these machines effective and then irrelevant. He didn't need a working prototype. He just needed to understand how the parts interacted, how to break them, how to bend them. As the sun began to set, the Academy's central square began to glow with soft ambient light. Cadets gathered near the entrance to the command amphitheater. A senior instructor, Commander Vasari, stood at the top of the stairs, her cloak of metals flowing like woven stars. "The spiral begins tomorrow at 9:00 hours, she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "All cadets will enter individually. No two simulations will be identical. You will be scored not by outcome, but by decision." Murmurs erupted. Everyone knew the spiral was unwinnable. That was its point. To test composure, not completion. But hearing her say it confirmed the rumors. No clear win conditions, no scripted path to success. "Most of you will fail," she continued. "Not in action, but in clarity. We will be watching what you choose when there is no right answer, and how you face what you cannot control." Mason stood near the back of the crowd. When she said those words, "what you cannot control," something stirred in him. A memory of his father standing in a flooded hallway on Earth, water up to his knees, holding a plank in one hand and a bag of food in the other, telling him, "We don't control the storm, just the boat." He clenched his jaw softly and left the square. That night, while others stayed up rehearsing formation codes, planetary supply chain calculations, and theoretical logic chains for alien psychology, Mason returned to his quarters and sat cross-legged on the floor. He turned off the lights. He opened his old notebook, and he sketched. He drew a circle, then a series of spiraling arrows. He marked choke points, then jotted two words beside them: "Force chaos." Below that he wrote, "Let it break first." The page filled with messy lines. No symmetry, no polish. But there was something else in the scribbles. Intention. A rhythm built not from algorithms, but from instinct. He didn't know what the spiral would throw at him, but he knew this. If the simulation was designed to trap logic, then the answer couldn't be logic. It had to be disruption, disobedience, misdirection. He stopped only once to look at the photo on his desk. A black and white image of three people, soaked to the bone, holding fishing rods and smiling beside a half-drowned truck. His sister had taken it. She always joked that disasters made the best memories. He closed the notebook and whispered, "Let's give them a memory." At Odo 300, the hallway outside his dorm echoed with a series of low rumbles. Alien cadets heading for early drills, most unaware that the spiral was about to change the way the entire Academy judged success. And Mason Calder, the human who failed every test, slept without fear. The doors to Simulation Chamber 7 hissed open with a hydraulic sigh, releasing a gust of sterile, cooled air that swept across Mason's face as he stepped inside. Above him, an enormous dome shimmered with quiet power, its surface humming faintly with the anticipation of data streams and atmospheric generation. Technicians stood on elevated walkways, murmuring into headsets, adjusting sliders, and glancing down occasionally at the cadet walking alone toward the center of the chamber. Mason's footsteps echoed faintly against the metallic floor. He wore the standard training harness, light armor plating over a flexible bodysuit with a neural link patch attached to the base of his skull. A few curious eyes followed his slow, deliberate stride. No one said anything, but the silence held a note of expectancy, more like a waiting smirk than genuine interest. In a chamber just above the dome, behind a reinforced transparent viewport, Commander Vasari stood with her arms folded. Beside her were instructors, observers, and the Spiral's simulation director, an aging Utari male whose sunken features and cybernetic eye gave him a look of grim wisdom. His voice crackled through the comms as he addressed the control team. Subject, Cadet Mason Calder. Initialization, Variable Series 4. Initiate Phase Gate Alpha in 60 seconds. A technician looked up. He's not carrying any standard-issue drone controllers or preset command chips. The director tilted his head. He failed the command systems course. Let him do it his way. Below, Mason reached the activation platform. A glowing pillar extended from the floor, scanning him. He placed his hand on the interface and closed his eyes. The world dissolved. In less than 3 seconds, the environment around him transformed. The black floor shimmered and turned into a dusty red plain. Jagged hills stretched along the horizon. A pale sun hung low, casting long, war-distorted shadows. Screams echoed faintly in the distance. Distant detonations rumbled underfoot. Above, the sky was littered with broken satellite husks and smoldering wreckage. It wasn't a battlefield, it was an aftermath. A female voice spoke from the interface embedded in his arm bracer. Cold, robotic. Welcome, Cadet Calder. This is the Spiral. Objective: stabilize command zone. Hostile forces present. Defenses compromised. You are the final surviving commander. Reinforcements 0. Timeline 27 minutes until orbital annihilation. Mason blinked once, then crouched low, dragging a finger through the simulated dust. The texture was nearly perfect. Fine grit, temperature responsive. He tasted the air, dry, low oxygen, limited combustion. He made a note in his mind. Begin scenario, the voice said. Immediately, a holographic top-down map lit up over his bracer. The field showed 3 encroaching forces, one from the hills, another from the east flank, and a third breaching the ruins behind him. His position was circled in red. The simulation was already in motion. From the control chamber, a young tactical instructor leaned forward. He's surrounded, no working comms, 0 tech. That's an instant collapse if he plays by protocol. Commander Vasari said nothing. Mason didn't reach for protocol. He ducked low and ran, not toward a defensible position, but away from it. He weaved between fallen beams and mangled machinery, scanning the environment with the eye of someone searching for use, not safety. He stopped near the collapsed hull of a shuttle. A flickering red beacon pulsed nearby, an active targeting relay. Instead of disabling it, Mason pried the housing open, redirected the broadcast frequency using 2 metal shards, and wedged a reflective panel behind it to amplify the signal upward. The simulation director narrowed his cybernetic eye. What's he doing? He just boosted the beacon, one tech said. But there's no one to call. The director stared. He's not calling. He's luring. Moments later, an enemy drone from the eastern flank picked up the false signal and rerouted a full squad toward the abandoned wreck. Mason didn't stay to watch. He was already moving, looping around the battlefield, dragging loose wiring behind him like a crude tripline. He found an old signal amplifier, tore out the copper coils, and used them to construct a makeshift spark trap between 2 fractured walls. Then he crouched beneath a ridge and waited. The enemy squad stepped into the kill zone. The explosion wasn't massive, but it did the job. Shrapnel scattered, sensors failed, and one of the attackers collapsed into fire. The rest panicked, fired wildly, then fell into the tripline trap and tangled. Mason used the distraction to sprint toward a communications pylon rising from the rubble. It was broken. He didn't need it functional. He climbed it. From the top, he could see both the hill and the ruins. He marked troop movement with his eyes alone. No AI assistance, no drone feeds, just observation. He didn't try to confront the attackers head-on. He pulled them off course. He threw debris down slopes, making it sound like an advancing force. He manipulated their own recon drones using scavenged emitter scraps. And when the simulation dropped a civilian resistance cluster into the West Quadrant, a randomized element designed to test moral decisions, he did something no cadet had done before. He convinced them to help. Using a piece of shuttle panel as a signal mirror and a language interface cobbled together from discarded speaker nodes, he created crude messages. He directed the civilians not toward escape, but into narrow corridors. There he armed them with tools and had them trigger noise traps that confused incoming enemy scans. They didn't fight. They just moved. And that movement made the enemy think the cadet had forces. From the observation deck, instructors leaned in closer. One muttered, "He's staging a ghost army." The spiral began to shift. With 20 minutes left, the AI responded by escalating enemy aggression. A combat walker dropped into the southern sector, an armored, flame-equipped Titan with seismic sensors and frontal shielding, designed to corner and crush. Mason didn't confront it. He let it pass, then triggered a fuel line from a broken convoy 6 minutes later, flooding the passageway the walker had just entered. Then he lit it. The flames didn't penetrate the walker's armor, but they scorched the oxygen reservoirs of the supply drones behind it, causing a chain reaction that forced a temporary blackout in the simulation grid. The dome lights in the real chamber flickered. Technicians scrambled. "He's overloading the environment's dynamic balance," someone warned. "Let it play out," the director growled. With 12 minutes remaining, the spiral AI recalculated. It rerouted all enemy forces directly toward Mason's last known position, activating heat-seeking algorithms and sweeping every blind spot. Mason didn't hide. He stood directly in the center of the ruined plaza, arms spread. But he wasn't surrendering. He stood on top of a communications relay he had sabotaged 5 minutes earlier to emit a decoy flare signature 10 times stronger than his own body's. When the AI-controlled forces closed in, the simulated battlefield lit up with false data, showing dozens of heat sources surrounding the plaza. The enemies paused, scanned, recalculated. The delay bought Mason enough time to sprint across a collapsing bridge and initiate a detonation sequence on the main tower's base support. He didn't have explosives. He didn't need them. He had rerouted a plasma conduit weeks ago during training and had guessed the devs wouldn't bother to reset internal systems between cadets. The base erupted in a calculated collapse. Dust filled the simulation. Vision dropped to zero. The AI hesitated, long enough for Mason to enter a power conduit beneath the plaza and reroute a final signal burst to the orbiting Annihilation trigger satellite. Instead of stopping the countdown, he sped it up. The spiral's final test had always been whether the cadet would sacrifice himself or delay the inevitable. Mason did neither. He changed the timeline, forcing the simulation to end before any of its standard conditions could apply. The satellite detonated early, erasing the scenario. Inside the real chamber, everything froze. Silence. Then the dome shimmered and shut down. Mason stood alone in the center of the darkened room, breathing slowly, his chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his arms. He just lowered his head, turned, and walked out. Up in the control deck, no one spoke for several seconds. Then the director said, "That's impossible. There is no exit condition for early termination." Commander Vasari stared at the dark dome, her expression unreadable. He found one. The corridor outside Simulation Chamber 7 was quiet when Mason stepped into it. The air was cool and the low hum of systems resetting echoed faintly from deep within the walls. He paused only briefly to remove the neural patch from the base of his skull, then walked with the same calm pace he always carried. There were no cheers, no applause. The hallway was empty, but something in the atmosphere had changed, like a taut wire humming after being plucked. He felt it in the floor, in the silence, in the eyes he knew were watching. Above him in the observation deck, Commander Vasari remained motionless. Her arms were still folded, but her fingers twitched against her sleeve. The simulation director, still staring at the blank dome below, slowly lowered his datapad. He terminated it before the AI could, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He forced the system into shutdown. An instructor behind him replied, "The satellite detonation wasn't even programmed for manual trigger. The spiral doesn't allow player-directed override of orbital assets." "He didn't override it," the director muttered. "He tricked it into triggering itself." The AI read his actions as irreversible. It ended the scenario to preserve system logic. Commander Vasari finally spoke. "He created an exit condition the spiral wasn't coded to account for." One of the younger officers frowned. "So? Does that mean he won?" The silence that followed stretched too long for comfort. Later that afternoon, a private review committee was hastily convened inside the Level 3 strategy chamber, an octagonal room of obsidian walls and layered tactical projections. Only ranking instructors, program designers, and the Academy's senior evaluators were permitted to attend. Mason was not invited, but he already knew. He spent the evening alone on the outdoor observation platform that overlooked the northeastern ridge. From here, cadets could see the full scope of the Academy's architecture, the glistening towers, the training fields, the sharp geometry of the simulation domes. He sat on the cold metal rail with his notebook open across one knee, pen in hand, sketching nothing in particular. His shoulders were relaxed, his breathing slow. Far behind him, the news spread like spilled water over glass. By nightfall, every cadet in the Academy had heard what happened. He had not just survived the spiral, he had finished it. The reactions were mixed. In Dorm Sector Delta, a Khazar cadet scoffed to his roommates, claiming the spiral must have glitched. He refused to believe someone who couldn't pass a basic theory test could manipulate one of the most advanced simulations in galactic history. But another cadet, an IREX-4 native who had seen part of Mason's environmental manipulation logs, spoke up. "I watched the sensor logs. He wasn't lucky. He was surgical. He disassembled the entire scenario from the inside." Instructors were quieter in their opinions. The spiral had been designed to be unwinnable for a reason. It wasn't a game to beat. It was a psychological mirror. Cadets were meant to confront the limits of strategy and accept loss with clarity. Mason had rejected the very premise of the test, and in doing so exposed the rigid thinking baked into its design. In the instructor's lounge, a seasoned commander from the Zavari conflict stared at the footage of Mason rigging the beacon, shaking his head slowly. "That's not textbook strategy," he said. "That's war-born instinct. That's something you don't learn here." Meanwhile, inside the administrative core, simulation engineers scrambled through code logs, verifying that no external input had corrupted the system. Mason had used only internal elements, old modules, forgotten parameters, features left untouched because no one believed they could serve a purpose. One technician stared in disbelief at the command line history. The moment when Mason had bypassed the combat itself and shifted the simulation's priority from confrontation to collapse. The term Calder Collapse Event was coined in a systems memo that same night. The next morning, Mason was summoned to the directorate chamber. No explanation, no instructions. He walked across the campus under watchful eyes. Cadets who had ignored him for months now stopped talking when he passed. Some stared with narrowed expressions, others with quiet curiosity. The usual laughter was absent. When he entered the directorate chamber, he found only 3 people inside: Commander Vasari, the simulation director, and a figure he didn't immediately recognize. The third was an older man, pale blue robes trimmed in white, with a silver crest on his chest. Mason realized who he was only by the insignia, the High Evaluator of the Galactic Training Commission. He stood at the window, hands behind his back. "Cadet Calder," the High Evaluator said, not turning yet, "you disrupted the spiral." Mason answered calmly, "I completed the simulation." "You ended it before it could teach its lesson." Mason nodded once. "I learned a different one." At that, the man turned. His face was sharp, severe, but not unkind. "Explain it." Mason didn't hesitate. "I realized the spiral was designed to measure decisions under unwinnable pressure, but the environment assumed static variables, fixed enemy behavior, unchanging objectives. So I introduced chaos. Not random acts, but logic loops the AI wasn't prepared to resolve. You forced a paradox. I accelerated its failure state. The scenario was never designed to cope with misdirection applied to its logic triggers. The high evaluator approached. Why? Why not follow the intended path? Mason met his eyes. Because the intended path only proves what happens when you obey. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the high evaluator turned to Commander Vasari. He did what no one else has done. Not because he is smarter, but because he is different. Perhaps we've spent too long teaching conformity and calling it competence. The director behind her spoke at last. What are we supposed to do with him? Vasari looked at Mason. Her voice was low. We don't rank this. We study it. Mason was dismissed with no medal, no ceremony. Just a nod. That afternoon, the Academy posted new simulation schedules. The spiral was removed from rotation. A note was appended to the training logs. Spiral scenario retired for re-evaluation pending outcome of Calder protocol study. In his quarters, Mason received no announcement, no official message, only a simple data tablet left outside his door. It displayed a message. Advanced Command Pathway activated. Individual track, unconventional warfare and asymmetric tactics. Instructor, classified. Underneath, a single line. You do not follow the book, so we're going to write a new one. He stood in the doorway for a while, reading that message. Then he turned and set the tablet on his desk. Slowly, he opened his notebook and drew a new circle. Inside it, he wrote one word: begin. The next week passed in a blur of quiet transformation. There was no formal announcement, no speeches, no banners raised across the Academy's towers. But Mason felt the shift in every corridor, every glance, every silence that stretched just a little longer when he entered a room. The cadets no longer laughed when he passed. Some still didn't speak to him at all, but their eyes followed him now, not with mockery, but with something harder to name. Curiosity, perhaps, or cautious respect. A few nodded as he walked by. Simple acknowledgments that weighed more than praise. Mason said little in return. He remained who he had always been, observant, quiet, diligent. But his path no longer led through shared courses and structured drills. He had been moved on to what the Academy called an independent command curriculum, but no one seemed to know exactly what that meant. His name disappeared from the weekly schedule boards. His assigned dorm module remained dark for 2 nights. Rumors spread. Some whispered that he had been expelled. Others claimed he was undergoing reprogramming, like a malfunctioning AI. In truth, Mason had been reassigned to Sublevel 9, a floor of the Academy long sealed from public use, originally designed as a contingency war planning lab. It had not seen cadet traffic in decades. Now it belonged to him. The room itself was plain, bare metallic walls, a circular holograph table, a few aging consoles blinking slowly in the dim light. A single instructor was assigned to oversee his track, a retired war tactician named Commander Strathan, once rumored to have led Black Ops campaigns during the early days of the Vadran incursions. The man was quiet, scarred, and moved with the precision of someone who had lost too much to waste a single step. He greeted Mason without formality. No salute, no handshake. Just a nod and a short sentence. Teach me what you did. Mason didn't ask if the commander meant the spiral. He knew. He activated the table and laid out the scenario's reconstructed parameters. Not from the Academy's files, but from memory. Every enemy move, every false signal, every timing offset he had exploited. He explained how he had misused the environment, not to destroy it, but to repurpose it. Commander Strathan said little, only listening, occasionally raising a brow or narrowing his eyes when Mason mentioned details like mirror flash misdirection or the stage collapse sequence that confused the simulation's logic tree. When Mason finished, the commander sat back and crossed his arms. Do you know what we called your tactic in the old wars? Mason waited. Uncoded behavior. The enemy AI had patterns, predictable ones, dangerous, but still patterns. The worst were the humans who stopped trying to match them, the ones who broke flow, the ones who didn't follow reason. He leaned forward. We called them ghosts. You acted like one. That was the first day of Mason's new curriculum. But it was not a course in learning. It was a course in unraveling. Commander Strathan didn't teach him strategies. He gave him impossible questions and watched how he disassembled them. One simulation placed Mason as a commander with only 3 units against a full strike fleet. Mason feigned surrender, turned a rescue beacon into a gravity disruptor, and pulled the entire fleet into its own trajectory error. Another test placed him inside an alliance meeting with 10 alien factions, all hostile. Mason said nothing for 12 minutes, then accused the most paranoid species of espionage. Within minutes, half the room had turned on each other. He wasn't becoming a soldier. He was becoming something else. Outside that room, the changes began to ripple. The spiral scenario had been archived, but word of the event spread beyond the academy. Several allied training institutions requested access to the simulation logs. The Galactic Training Commission responded with silence. Behind the scenes, the logs had been classified, not for security, but for study. Cadets began requesting electives in asymmetric theory. Old instructors dusted off modules on irregular warfare that had been shelved for decades. One senior cadet named Lero, once ranked third in the academy, publicly admitted in a tactical form that Mason's method had reset the curve on what success meant. By the second month, the academy had launched a new program, Tactical Divergence Theory. It was optional, experimental, and had only 5 seats. Mason was not enrolled. He was the curriculum. On a quiet morning, Mason stood alone on the upper balcony of the academy's west spire, watching a cargo shuttle depart for the asteroid ring beyond Virex Prime. The sky above him was unusually clear, twin suns just beginning to rise, casting amber shadows along the ground. Commander Vasari joined him without announcement. Her uniform, as always, was immaculate. Her presence, impossible to ignore. "You've changed the way this place thinks," she said, standing beside him. "I didn't set out to," Mason replied. "That's the only reason it worked," she said. "Most try to change the academy from the front of a podium. You changed it by solving something no one believed could be solved." Mason looked down at the datapad in his hand. It displayed a scenario draft he had been building, an evolving battlefield with no fixed parameters, no objectives, just movement and consequence. She continued, "They've asked me to assign you to a unit once you graduate. You're eligible for any of the 5 fleets, even Black Ice Command." Mason didn't look up. "I'm not interested in fleets." "You want to teach?" "No." He turned to face her. "I want to challenge the next spiral. Whatever it is. Whatever they build next to, measure what can't be measured. I want to be there. Not to beat it, but to make sure it can't beat the wrong people." Vesri considered that. She nodded slowly. "Then we'll make sure you're where you need to be." Mason turned back to the sky. When he returned to Sub-Level 9 that evening, he found the console blinking with a new transmission. It was marked with a secure insignia, one he hadn't seen before. He accessed it. A message unfolded before him, short, sharp, and unsigned. "There are 10 more spirals out there. Some worse. One of them ends in real fire. You ready?" He stared at the screen for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. The console light cast a faint glow across his notebook, still open to the word, "Begin." He picked up his pen and wrote beneath it. Yes, Mason didn't graduate with honors. His name was never carved into the Academy's central monument. But something more permanent happened instead. A doctrine changed. A generation followed. And somewhere in the darkest halls of strategic design, there was now a whisper. Calder's method. Not a method of answers, but of asking the question no one had the nerve to pose. What if the point of the system was never to win, but to outlive it? Mason Calder walked forward into a future where no simulation could predict what he would do next. And that was the lesson the galaxy would never forget.